Hey everyone, Nigel here. As you're probably aware by now, for the last month we've been taking a bit of a break from our usual Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Next week we're going to be back with all new editions of both shows, but in the meantime we've got one final compilation series for you, and it's one that we think you'll enjoy. In the past we've done videos covering cold cases that were solved in a given year. Generally we've done this in longer form style, meaning we're usually only able to showcase a couple of notable stories. This time we decided to take a different approach. We're going to bring you every cold case news story we've covered this year through our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International series. Because there are so many of these stories, we've decided to split this up into two parts, the second half of which will be released at the end of the week. Just keep in mind that because this is a compilation video, these segments have not been edited since they appeared in their respective lists, so more news might have been released since we first covered them. Anyway, be sure to let us know what you think of this new approach to covering cold cases in the comments section below, and if it's something you'd like to see again going forward. With that out of the way, here is part 1 of Cold Cases Solved in 2024.
Authorities in Bucks County, Pennsylvania released a major announcement in a terrifying cold case murder and robbery case this week, announcing that after more than a decade, one of the suspects allegedly responsible has finally been arrested and charged. According to reports, the case began nearly 11 years ago on January 18, 2013, when two armed men broke into the Hilltown Township home of 48-year-old Joseph Cannizzaro. Though Joseph's girlfriend was able to grab a revolver, she quickly decided against attacking the intruders after realizing she was majorly outgunned. After that, she, Joseph, and Joseph's 12-year-old son were quickly rounded up by the men. One of them took Joseph and headed off into another part of the house demanding money, while the other took the woman into the bathroom and sexually assaulted her. After the brutal assault was over, the female victim was tied up alongside Joseph's son in the basement. They were eventually able to free themselves, at which point they called police. Sadly, by the time authorities arrived, it was too late. Joseph Cannizzaro was found stabbed to death in the garage, and the two perpetrators had managed to escape. They had taken the 48-year-old's truck with them, along with a number of valuables from inside the residence. Upon launching an investigation, detectives were able to locate the stolen truck, which had been left in the parking lot of Quakertown Plaza Shopping Center. Surveillance footage revealed that the suspects had driven the vehicle there after the crime and loaded stolen valuables from the crime scene into a waiting Nissan sedan, which they then used to flee the area. The case eventually went cold. For several years, little progress was apparently made until a re-examination of evidence took place in 2019. That's when a DNA profile was obtained from a face covering found in Joseph's truck, as well as a sample taken from the female victim's rape kit. That profile recently came back as a match to a 50-year-old man named Thomas Delgado. Delgado was arrested this week and is now facing several charges, including murder, kidnapping, rape, and robbery. While little insight has been provided into the motive behind the crime, local news sources state that Joseph and Delgado had known each other for years at the time of the crime and apparently exchanged a number of phone calls in 2011. At the time of his murder, Joseph also owed millions of dollars to various creditors, including some casinos. Though Delgado is now in custody, it appears that the cold case is only half solved. Reports do not mention whether police have been able to identify the second perpetrator allegedly involved in the crime, nor whether they are close to making any additional arrests.
Representatives from the NYPD released a major update in the cold case killing of a mother of 5 this week, announcing that after nearly 9 years, a suspect had finally been arrested in connection with her murder. The case began back on March 4th, 2015, when police were called to a West Bronx apartment building on Webster Avenue near Alden Place. They arrived to find the body of 41-year-old Michelle Cox, who was lying in the building's stairwell. She had been shot once at close range in the back of the head and was pronounced dead at the scene. Tragically, Michelle left behind 2 daughters, ages 8 and 17, as well as 3 adult sons. After launching an investigation, detectives reportedly considered a number of theories in the case. They began with the idea that the shooting was a case of mistaken identity. However, as time went on, they switched to the incident being a targeted attack. A number of suspects were considered, including the father of one of the 41-year-old's sons, though sadly, nothing panned out and the case eventually went cold. That all changed recently, when authorities reportedly discovered that Michelle had connections to a local gang in the area. So far, they haven't revealed what these connections are, though the news apparently came as a shock to those close to Michelle. Police now allege that her death was the result of a gang feud. They also believe that they have now arrested the person responsible for her killing, a 34-year-old Harlem man named LaSalle Herman. According to investigators, Michelle was on her way home from the store on the day of her murder and was walking up the stairs to her apartment because the elevator in her building wasn't working. She was attacked from behind while she was in the stairwell. At the time of this recording, Herman remains in custody and is now facing murder charges. Authorities say that they do not believe Michelle and Herman knew each other. They also have not revealed how they connected the 34-year-old to the case after nearly 9 years. The situation is still developing. Officials in Colorado and Nevada say that they have each closed a decades-old cold case this week after they linked 2 murders nearly 16 years apart to the same killer, who they have now successfully identified. According to reports, the whole thing began back on December 6, 1975, when a pair of motorcyclists in Westminster, Colorado, called 911 with a disturbing report. While riding near 100th Avenue and Lowell Boulevard, they had found the body of a woman. She was lying in a field along with her clothes and other personal items. She had been strangled to death and sexually assaulted. The victim was soon identified as Terry Becker, who had last been seen 2 days earlier while she was hitchhiking to see her boyfriend about 20 miles away in Brighton. Sadly, despite the best efforts of investigators at the time, authorities were unable to solve Terry's murder. The case was periodically re-examined over the years, particularly after DNA evidence started being widely used. In 2003, a sample belonging to an unknown male was extracted from evidence at the scene and submitted to COTWIN. However, it returned no matches. It wasn't until 10 years later, in 2013, that detectives would get their next real lead, when they were contacted by law enforcement counterparts in Las Vegas, Nevada. They had been investigating a cold case with an almost identical MO, the murder of 31-year-old Sherry Bridgewater. Sherry was found dead by a friend and a relative in May of 1991 inside her apartment on the 1000 block of Monroe Street. She had also been strangled and sexually assaulted, and for years her murder had likewise gone unsolved. When Las Vegas police had entered DNA evidence from the case into COTWIN, it had come back as a match to the unknown suspect in the Terry Becker case. From this point on, both investigative teams began to work together on the 2 cases, though still for several more years the identity of the perpetrator remained a mystery. When they learned about forensic genetic genealogy and how it was being applied to similar cases across the country, investigators decided to pursue the new technique as well. After an additional 4 years of hard work, police were finally handed a name in 2022. Their perpetrator was a man named Thomas Martin Elliott. Detectives looked into Elliott's background, discovering that he had an extensive criminal history and that he had been in Colorado and Nevada respectively at the time of the murders. The only problem was that Elliott had been dead for more than 3 decades. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound just months after Sherry's murder. It took more than another year, but finally in October of 2023, authorities were able to exhume Elliott's body from where he had been buried in Nevada. Testing on the remains recently revealed that his DNA was a match to the unknown samples at both of the cold case crime scenes. This week, police in Nevada and Colorado each announced that they were now closing both of the cases. They say that they are thrilled to have finally brought closure to Sherry and Terry's families. Authorities in Virginia's Stafford and Fairfax counties released a major update in a nearly 4-decade-long investigation this week, announcing that a suspect had finally been arrested in connection with the cold case murders of 2 local women. According to reports, the case began all the way back on the morning of November 15, 1986, when employees at Mount Vernon Realty in Stafford County arrived to find a horrifying scene at their offices. When they went inside, they found signs of a violent struggle. There was discarded clothing, items had been scattered on the floor, and there was blood in various places. Disturbingly, it was quickly realized that one of their co-workers was missing. No one had seen or heard from 40-year-old Jacqueline Laird since the previous night, when she was working late at the office. Her car was also missing from the parking lot. A search was launched for Jacqueline, one that came to a chilling end on November 16th when two juveniles made an awful discovery while playing in a wooded area in the city of Woodbridge, just over the county line. Underneath a pile of discarded carpet was Jacqueline's body. It was later determined that she had died of asphyxiation with a ligature. Though Jacqueline's car was also found a little over a month later, this would be the last major clue authorities found during their initial investigation. Sadly, leads were quickly exhausted, and the case went cold. 3 years later, on the night of March 29, 1989, another woman, 18-year-old Amy Baker, also disappeared in Stafford County. She had been on her way home at the time after visiting family members in Falls Church, though would never arrive. At 9:55 p.m., her car would be found abandoned by Virginia State troopers at the side of Interstate 95. Eerily, many of her personal belongings were still inside. Tragically, Amy's body would be found 2 days later on March 31st in a wooded area a little ways up the interstate. Just like Jacqueline, she had died from asphyxiation with a ligature. The original investigation into her murder was also a similar story. Police were able to determine that she had likely run out of gas and had been walking down the road when she was abducted. However, little else was uncovered. Despite the similarities, it appears that the women's cases weren't actually linked until recently. The connection came when authorities reached out to a couple of laboratories to re-examine evidence in both cases with modern DNA techniques and technology. When the results came back and further investigation was carried out, all of the evidence allegedly pointed to one man, 65-year-old Elroy Harrison. Harrison reportedly has a previous criminal record for robbing a bank in Virginia in 1983. He was released for that crime just months before Jacqueline's murder. Harrison was arrested at his home in Stafford County this week and is now facing charges including murder, abduction, assault, and burglary. So far, all of these charges are in connection with Jacqueline's murder. However, police say that they are working on bringing charges against him for Amy's killing as well. At the time of this recording, the situation is still developing. Authorities in Alamance County, North Carolina released a massive update in a nearly 45-year-old cold case murder this week, announcing that they had finally uncovered the suspect responsible for the heinous crime. The disturbing case began all the way back on June 30th, 1979, when 20-year-old college student Tammy Sue Aldridge was abducted while jogging down Fawcett Lane on the outskirts of the city of Burlington. Over the next couple of days, she was allowed to call home twice, and there were hopes that she would be released safely. However, that all came to an end on July 3rd when a devastating discovery was made. Tammy's body was found lying in the middle of the road on Highway 54. Her ankles were bound with rope, and her body was still warm to the touch, suggesting that she hadn't been dead that long. An autopsy revealed that Tammy had been strangled, likely with a rope, considering further marks to her wrists and neck. There were also signs of a sexual assault, something that was evidenced by the fact that the 20-year-old's shorts were on backwards and her shirt was upside down when her remains were found. While a suspect was arrested and charged in the case following an initial investigation, he was found not guilty. This is a good thing, as it turns out this man was completely innocent, though unfortunately at this point the case went cold. It would stay that way until 2020, when a new team of investigators reopened the case. When they did, they began to consider a new suspect, a man named Gary Lane Laframboise. Laframboise lived just a few miles away from where Tammy's body was discovered back in 1979, and he had a lengthy criminal record. He was also accused of being involved in a similar kidnapping case just a few months after Tammy was killed. When testing was done on evidence from the crime scene using modern DNA techniques, an unknown male profile was able to be extracted from a feminine hygiene product found with Tammy's remains. This profile was recently tested against relatives of Laframboise's, revealing that he was almost certainly responsible for Tammy's murder. Frustratingly, Laframboise can no longer be held legally responsible for his actions, since he died the same year the case was reopened back in 2020. However, police say that they are pleased that the case has now been finally solved and hope that this provides the family and friends of Tammy Sue Aldridge with some semblance of closure. Authorities in Indian River County, Florida released a massive update in a more than 5-decade-old cold case this week, announcing that after all this time they have finally identified at least one of the people responsible for the killing of a decorated World War II veteran. The case began all the way back in April of 1968 when Hiram Ross Graham failed to return home from work. The World War II veteran, who had received a Purple Heart for his military service, was supposed to be finished his milk delivery route for the day. However, by that evening, he was nowhere to be found. Ross's son, Larry, who was 16 at the time, says that he and the rest of the family hadn't really started to worry. That was, until an investigator with the local sheriff's department showed up and explained that his father was missing. A subsequent search confirmed everyone's worst fears. Ross's body was found in a densely wooded area near the city of Vero Beach. He was near his abandoned milk truck and had been shot multiple times execution style. Though witnesses said that they had seen Ross speaking with two men in the historically black Gifford area of the county, this was apparently dismissed by investigators at the time. Because the murder happened just after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the local sheriff reportedly feared that a racially motivated crime might inflame tensions in the community. It's unclear what leads were actually pursued at the time, but what we do know is that the case eventually went cold. Fast forward to 2006, when rumors emerged that a man named Thomas J. Williams was one of the two people who had killed Ross. This theory quickly built up momentum, prompting Williams to write a letter to the editor of a local paper claiming his innocence. Unfortunately, things petered out from here once again. It wasn't until Williams died in 2016 that more people apparently began to come forward. This included a friend of Williams' sister and his ex-wife, who finally spoke to police in 2023. Neither of these witnesses knew each other, but both separately claimed that Williams had confessed to Ross's murder. They said that they had been afraid to come forward before this because Williams was dangerous and had threatened them and their families. Police say that they believe these witnesses are credible and now have enough evidence that they can confidently say that Williams was one of those responsible for Ross's murder. As for the motive, sources contradict each other, though several claim that the case is believed to have been a robbery. Specifically, that Williams and his accomplice made off with $68 worth of cash collected on Ross's milk route, a sum that would be worth around $600 in today's money. While the identity of the second killer remains a mystery at this time, according to some reports, police do have a suspect in mind. So far, though, this man's name has not been released. Ross's son Larry says that the news that the case has been partially solved is bittersweet, but that he's pleased to finally have some answers after all this time. Authorities with West Virginia's Raleigh County released a major update in a nearly 24-year-old cold case double murder investigation this week, announcing that not only had the case officially been solved, but that after all this time, the bodies of the two victims had finally been recovered. According to reports, mother and daughter Susan and Natasha Alex Carter were last seen on August 8, 2000. At the time, Susan was 41 and Alex was just 10 years old. When authorities began investigating the sudden disappearances, the first place they looked was at Susan's former husband and Alex's father, Rick Lafferty. At the time, Susan and Rick were embroiled in a bitter custody battle over Alex. Shortly before the two were last seen, Susan had reportedly threatened that she would never let Rick see their daughter again. However, this ultimately turned out to be a dead end. Rick was completely innocent and had nothing to do with the disappearances. Though the case eventually went cold, Rick was convinced he knew who was responsible, a man named Larry Webb, who Susan and Alex had been staying with at the time. While it appears that police were also suspicious of Webb, for reasons that are not entirely clear, at the time of the initial investigation, they were never able to prove that he was involved. However, that began to change in 2021 when the case was reopened and looked at by a fresh team from the FBI. Over the next 3 years, at least 2 searches were conducted of Webb's home in Beckley. Enough new evidence was found that in November of 2023, he was indicted for first-degree murder in connection with the case and taken into custody. Now in his 80s and in failing health, Webb finally agreed to speak with investigators earlier this month while being held at the Mount Olive Correctional Complex. It was here, on his deathbed, that he offered a disturbing confession. Webb told authorities that he had killed Susan during the middle of an argument over money. During the time that she and Alex were staying with him, he was apparently having financial difficulties and came to believe that Susan was stealing from him. He confronted her, things escalated, and he shot her. In a bid to cover up what he had done, Webb said he killed Alex as well, saying that he felt like he had to do it or else he would be caught. He said he stored the bodies in his basement for 2 days while he dug a hole in a forested area on his property before finally burying them. He claimed he cried himself to sleep throughout that process. Webb died while in custody this week on April 22nd, shortly after making his confession. In a darkly poetic twist, the bodies of Susan and Alex were found just hours after Webb took his last breaths. Following the announcement this week, Rick Lafferty thanked police for their hard work and talked about the mixed emotions that the situation brought after so many years. In a statement, he said that it was a sad day, but also a happy one, because, quote, "I can finally bring my baby home." Representatives from the NYPD announced a major update in a more than 2-decade-old cold case murder investigation this week, revealing that after all this time they have finally been able to identify the Jane Doe victim. The case began all the way back on February 10th, 2003, when a construction team was carrying out demolition work at a building in Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen neighborhood. As part of the job, the crew were in the basement of the property, located on West 46th Street near 8th Avenue, and were breaking apart concrete. They had just cracked a slab of the material when, to their horror, a human skull rolled out. After police were called and began an investigation, the rest of a fully intact skeleton was discovered close by. It had been wrapped in a rug, with the victim having been hog-tied with electrical cord and forced into the fetal position. While the skeleton was determined to belong to a female between the ages of 15 and 21, police quickly realized that they were going to be fighting an uphill battle with the investigation. The remains had clearly been here for decades before they were found. Among the few additional clues found in the clandestine grave were a bra, pantyhose, a plastic toy soldier, a dime minted in 1969, and a ring. The ring received the bulk of the attention from authorities because it was engraved with the letters P. McG. It was concluded that these were likely the female victim's initials. Unfortunately, when police tried to match these initials to missing persons cases across the country, they hit a dead end. The case was featured on shows like America's Most Wanted to try and generate new leads, but again, authorities came up short. For years, the female victim simply became known as the Midtown Jane Doe. While police haven't revealed what led to the recent break in the case, they have said that it was DNA that finally led to a successful identification. Strangely, it appears that the Midtown Jane Doe was identified in part thanks to a DNA match with a relative who died on 9/11. That's how we know that her actual name was Patricia Kathleen McGlone. In other words, police had been right all these years about the ring being a match to the victim's initials. During the announcement this week, authorities stated that Patricia was a New York local and had grown up in Brooklyn's Sunset Park neighborhood. They were also able to confirm that she had died in 1969 at the age of 16. While an investigation into Patricia's actual murder and all of the details surrounding it is still ongoing at this time, police additionally revealed that the basement where the teen's body was concealed was a popular nightclub at the time. It was called Steve Paul's The Scene and was a venue where famous acts at the time like Jimi Hendrix and The Doors had performed. The club ceased operation the year after Patricia's murder in 1970. The investigation continues. Representatives from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation released a major announcement in a more than 2-decade-old murder investigation this week, revealing that after all these years they had finally arrested and charged a suspect in connection with the cold case. The case began all the way back on the morning of January 19th, 2001, when emergency responders were called to the scene of a fire at a home on Fawn Drive in the city of Athens. When firefighters went inside, they discovered the body of 23-year-old Tara Louise Baker. It was immediately clear that this was no accident. Not only had the fire been started deliberately, but Tara showed signs of having been brutally attacked. An autopsy would later reveal that she had died from ligature strangulation. She had also suffered stab wounds to her neck and blunt force trauma to the head. When police began investigating the murder, they learned that Tara was a first-year law student at the nearby University of Georgia. She had last been seen there at around 7:30 p.m. the previous night while she was at the UGA Law School library. A little over 2 hours later, the 23-year-old called one of her friends to make sure that they had gotten home safely. At the same time, she said she was planning to leave the library at 10 p.m. Though extensive efforts were made to identify Tara's killer back in 2001, much to the frustration of detectives, nothing panned out. The case eventually went cold and would stay that way for the next 2 decades. Well, it's not exactly clear what led to a breakthrough after all this time. According to statements made during this week's announcement, it began in September of 2023 when the GBI's cold case unit partnered with the Athens Clarke County Police Department to, quote, conduct an in-depth review and analysis of the ongoing investigation into Tara's death. This review and analysis finally led to a suspect, 48-year-old Edric Lamont Faust. According to reports, Faust was arrested at the end of last month and is now facing a number of charges, including murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and arson. The 48-year-old apparently already has a lengthy criminal history. Disturbingly, this includes an aggravated assault that reportedly happened less than 3 weeks after Tara Baker's murder. Following the announcement, Tara's family said that they were grateful to finally have some answers after all these years, and thanked both the GBI and the Athens Clarke County Police. They also said that they continue to remember Tara as a champion of justice, someone who was fiercely loyal and who believed in using the law to help people. In May of 2003, just over 2 years after her murder, Tara was posthumously awarded her law degree from the UGA's School of Law. At the time of this recording, Edric Faust remains in custody while proceedings in the case continue. Representatives from California's Ventura Police Department released a massive update in a nearly 33-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, they have finally unmasked the suspected killer. The case began all the way back on the morning of July 16, 1991, when the body of 42-year-old Danielle Claus was found on a hillside near Tioga Drive. Her partially clothed remains had been left in a flood catch basin and had been brutally beaten. Her husband reported her missing after she failed to return home the night before. An autopsy determined that Danielle's cause of death was from repeated blows to the head, and that she had also been the victim of a sexual assault. Witnesses described seeing her talking to an unknown man in a white truck on the night of her disappearance. However, at the time, this man could never be located. All other leads in the case were soon exhausted as well. Though a wealth of physical evidence existed in the case and was tested and retested over the years, leading to a DNA profile of the killer being recovered, this did not produce any matches in the CODIS database. That was until 2021. When Ventura police began pursuing a different kind of DNA technique, with the widespread adoption of forensic genetic genealogy. While the technique took some time, as it has with so many other cases over the past several years, eventually it led to a breakthrough. Specifically, the DNA pointed to 2 brothers as being the potential killer. One of those brothers was ultimately ruled out. However, the second turned out to be a match. He has now been identified as Larry Welch. Apparently, Welch and Danielle had no prior connection before the crime. Unfortunately, Welch can no longer be held legally responsible for his actions, as he died in 1999, just a few years after Danielle's murder. However, the news has still been a comfort to members of Danielle's family, who say that they are grateful to finally know who is responsible after all these years. In a statement after the announcement, Danielle's sister, Marcy Forte, said that her prayers had been answered and that she was so happy to have lived to see at least some amount of justice. She also reiterated that Danielle was so much more than just a victim, saying, quote, she was an artist, a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a wife. She was a good person with a mighty soul, and she was taken way too young.
Representatives from the NYPD released a major update in a more than 15-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that they had finally identified and arrested a suspect thanks to the help of genetic genealogy. The case began back on February 10, 2009, when police were called to the home of 64-year-old Rosario Prestigiacomo. Neighbors reported hearing a disturbance coming from the Queen's property, saying it sounded like someone inside was involved in an argument. When officers arrived around 2:15 p.m., they received no response at the front door, but were able to enter through a first-floor window. When they did, they found Rosario dead in his hallway. The 64-year-old had been beaten with a shovel and stabbed at least 16 times, sustaining wounds to his face, neck, and chest. Though DNA evidence was recovered at the scene belonging to the alleged perpetrator, unfortunately, no matches could be found at the time. Eventually, the original investigation went cold. The situation would stay that way until March of 2022, when NYPD investigators decided to reach out to genetic genealogy company Othram Inc. With their help, they were able to develop a profile of the suspect, which was eventually traced back to one man, 41-year-old Anthony Scalisi. Scalisi was the victim's nephew, though the pair were related by marriage, explaining why they had no DNA in common. Earlier this year, investigators found Scalisi living in Boynton Beach, Florida, and conducted surveillance on him. They were waiting until he discarded something they could use for further DNA testing, and eventually got lucky when they found a fork the 41-year-old had thrown out. When the DNA on the utensil was compared to evidence found under Rosario's fingernails at the 2009 crime scene, it was revealed to be a match to Scalisi. The 41-year-old was arrested on May 14th and was extradited back to New York this week. He is now facing a charge of second-degree murder and remains in custody. So far, no information has been released about the alleged motive behind the killing.
Representatives from the NYPD released a major update in a nearly 20-year-old cold case murder this week, announcing that after all this time they had finally arrested a suspect in connection with the murder of a young mother. The case began sometime on the morning of November 23, 2005, when police were called to the townhouse apartment of 28-year-old Erica Robertson. The young mother had been found dead on the floor of her home, located in the Bronx's Morris Heights neighborhood. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest, and there was blood all over the floor. Disturbingly, Erica's 12-year-old daughter was the one who found her. The timing of the murder couldn't have been more tragic. In addition to leaving the young girl without a mother, it had also happened just as Erica was really beginning to get her life together. The Ohio native had moved to New York 4 years earlier, but had struggled to get by. About a year earlier, she had finally been able to move out of a local homeless shelter and into her own place. She had a job as a security guard at another local shelter for people with mental health issues, and was looking forward to celebrating Thanksgiving. The same day that she was killed, Erica had planned to make a big feast for friends and coworkers at her home. She had been so excited that the day before she went out and got an entirely new set of pots and pans. Sadly, despite the best efforts of police at the time, the investigation into Erica's murder eventually stalled. It would stay that way for more than 18 years, until a new investigation was able to crack the case. While few details of this new investigation have been released so far, police have said that DNA evidence played an integral part. It allegedly pointed to one man, Erica's ex-boyfriend, now 54-year-old James DeVore. DeVore was arrested in Mansfield, Ohio this week and has now been charged with second-degree murder. He is currently awaiting extradition back to New York. Representatives from Florida's Miramar Police Department released a massive update in a more than 37-year-old cold case murder this week, announcing that after all these years they had finally identified a suspect in connection with the brutal killing. The case began all the way back on October 21, 1986, when the girlfriend of 28-year-old William Billy Halpern found him brutally murdered inside his townhome. The former firefighter and bodybuilder had been beaten, bound with electrical tape, and had his throat slashed from ear to ear. While there were many suspects and theories at the time of the initial investigation, especially because there were no signs of forced entry at the property, unfortunately, eventually detectives hit a dead end. That's when the case went cold. Things stayed that way until January of this year, when a new team of investigators reopened the case file and discovered that there were several partial DNA profiles that had been collected back in 1986 that were never tested. These were analyzed, and after being combined with tips from a fresh appeal for information to the public, they pointed to one man, Harry Collier. Unfortunately, Collier can no longer be held legally responsible for the crime, as he was murdered himself just 7 months after Billy. According to police, this murder, as well as several others, were part of a complex network of crimes that helped them to finally come up with an explanation behind Billy's death. In a statement this week, police explained that back in 1986, Billy had worked out at a gym in Hollywood, Florida called Apollo. The owner of this gym, Hubert Burt Christie, was known to have mob connections, and several of the regulars there were apparently involved in organized crime. This included a former Miami-Dade police officer, Gilbert Fernandez, who at one point had been a suspect in Billy's murder. While Fernandez was ruled out as being involved in the case using the same DNA that was used to identify Collier, he and Christie were later arrested and convicted of the murders of 3 other people. As for Collier, police say that they were able to link him to Billy's killing after they connected the MO between that crime and a double murder in the city of Tamarack. In that case, a couple were killed in a remarkably similar way, with police stating, quote, "In both of these scenes, we had no forced entry, we had use of a sharp-edged weapon, we had the method of binding all 3 victims was very similar, and it was unique in the sense that the way their hands were bound together and the fact that black electrical tape was used to bind them really painted a picture as to modus operandi. So the way that the murder scene in Tamarack was laid out, very similar if not exact to the Halpern murder scene." Police went on to say that Collier's fingerprints had been found at this second crime scene, and that just 8 days later, he and another man were found murdered in Pembroke Pines. This, as well as dozens of other interviews with witnesses, has led authorities to believe that Billy Halpern was killed because of his proximity to organized crime figures. Specifically, investigators think that he learned information that he wasn't supposed to know and became a liability. In that same statement from before, they said, quote, "Definitely at the gym, he heard certain things about certain crimes, and the idea is that he just wouldn't play ball. He was not going to keep quiet about it. He was really a loose end for those that could potentially be held responsible for their crimes as a result of what Billy may say. He knew something that he just shouldn't have known, and he heard something that he shouldn't have heard." At the time of this recording, police say that the case has been cleared, however it has not been officially closed, as they are still investigating the possibility that other people were involved. Anyone with information is encouraged to reach out to the Miramar police. Representatives from Australia's New South Wales Police released a major update in a more than 26-year-old cold case murder investigation last week, announcing that after all this time, they have finally arrested the person they believe is responsible for the crime. The case began all the way back in the early morning hours of March 10, 1998, when police received a 000 emergency call from a residence in the Sydney suburb of Dover Heights. They were called by then 55-year-old Aaron Govender, who said that he and his wife had just been the victims of a violent home invasion. When help arrived at the scene, Aaron explained that they had opened the door that morning to a man pretending to be a police officer. Terrifyingly, by the time that they had realized what was going on, it was too late. The man had forced his way inside and attacked. Aaron had been knocked unconscious and restrained with cable ties. He had awoken to find his 53-year-old wife Denise in much worse shape. She had been viciously beaten in the head. Sadly, she didn't survive. Initially, it seemed that the motive behind the crime had been robbery, as the Govenders' 1997 Ford Laser had been stolen from their driveway. When the vehicle was recovered about a mile from the crime scene 11 days later, investigators were optimistic. However, this is where the investigation hit a wall. During subsequent press conferences, Aaron recounted his horrifying story, pleading for members of the public to come forward with information for him and his 2 grieving children. However, no trace of the mysterious perpetrator was ever found. After all these years, it seems we finally know why. According to police, Aaron Govender made it all up. This week, New South Wales police announced that they had arrested and charged Aaron for Denise's murder. They now allege that he staged the robbery and fabricated the story of the home invader disguised as a police officer to cover up the fact that he had actually killed his wife. While it's unclear what caused the incredible development after all these years, from what authorities have said, there's no one smoking gun. Rather, it seems that the arrest is the result of years of slow police work, much of which was built on the case that the original investigative team did back in 1998. However, a spokesperson for the New South Wales Police did say that since 2021, when the case was officially reopened, they have gathered new medical and forensic evidence, as well as additional statements from witnesses. Aaron was arrested on August 15th and has since been charged with murder. He has been granted bail, though with conditions such that he must surrender his passport and not contact any witnesses in the case, including his own children. The situation is still developing. Authorities in the Australian state of Victoria released a massive update in a more than 47-year-old cold case double murder investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, a suspect has finally been arrested in connection with the notorious crime. The case began all the way back on January 13, 1977, when police were called about a chilling discovery that had been made at a property in the Melbourne suburb of Collingwood. It was here, inside of a shared home on Easy Street, that officers found the bodies of two women. They were quickly identified as local school teachers, 27-year-old Suzanne Armstrong and 28-year-old Susan Bartlett. Both had been horrifically stabbed dozens of times, and Susan had also been raped. Making the situation even more unsettling, Susan's 16-month-old son had been left in his crib to fend for himself. Though the child managed to survive, it was believed he had been there for approximately 3 days before he was found. Given the disturbing nature of what happened, a high-profile investigation was quickly launched. However, authorities were unable to solve the crime at the time. As years began to pass, the case was referred to simply as the Easy Street murders, and became one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in Victoria's history. Finally, in 2017, progress began to be made in the case when it was re-examined by a new team of investigators. They zeroed in on a then 16-year-old boy named Perry Karumblis. Karumblis, a dual Australian and Greek citizen, lived less than 400 yards away from the grisly crime scene at the time. He was also a student at the school where Susan Bartlett worked. What investigators were particularly interested in, though, was a suspicious interaction that Karumblis had with police shortly after the crime took place. After being pulled over for a traffic stop, an officer had found a blood-stained knife in the trunk of his car. That knife was taken in for examination, and the evidence on it was later found to be a match to the blood type of one of the two victims. At the time, Karumblis had told detectives that he found the weapon on some nearby railway tracks, a story that they apparently believed. After learning this, investigators in 2017 reached out to Karumblis and requested a DNA sample from him. He initially agreed, then fled the country and went back to his native Greece. Police say that subsequent DNA tests from the now 65-year-old's family members implicated him as their suspect. Understandably, Karumblis fleeing the country was a frustrating development, particularly because Greece does not have an extradition agreement with Australia. According to reports, the hopes of arresting him while he remained there were effectively non-existent. That all changed this week, though, when Karumblis was arrested at an airport after traveling to Rome, Italy. The circumstances surrounding that trip remain a mystery, though there is currently widespread speculation that Australian authorities were somehow involved in luring the 65-year-old there so that he could be captured. At the time of this recording, Karumblis remains in Italian custody, and authorities in Australia are now working to get their case together so that they can have him extradited on murder charges. Speaking about the situation this week, Victoria Police revealed that it was the longest-running cold case they had solved in the state's history. In a statement, Chief Commissioner Shane Patton said in part, quote, "This was a crime that struck at the heart of our community. Two women in their own home where they should have felt their safest. While we still have some way to go, this arrest is an important breakthrough. I also want to recognize the enduring resilience of both the Armstrong and Bartlett families, who have grieved for over 4 decades, and no doubt this will be a very emotional time for them. I hope this arrest brings you closer to the answers you so richly deserve and have waited so long for." Authorities in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh say that they are investigating chilling accusations in the 30-year-old disappearance of a missing father, after they were approached with horrifying new information by the man's youngest son. According to local media, the whole thing started recently when a 39-year-old man named Punjabi Singh showed up at a police station in the city of Hathras with an alarming claim. He stated that he had reason to believe that he knew where to find his father, Buddha Singh, who had been missing since 1994. Not only that, he said he was pretty sure his own family members were responsible for his disappearance. Punjabi explained that a couple of months back he had gotten into an argument over money with two of his older brothers, Mukesh and Pradeep. Things had gotten extremely heated, at which point he said the pair had threatened him. The specifics, however, sent chills down his spine. They warned him that if he kept this up, they would send him to be with their father. The threats apparently brought back memories that Punjabi had been repressing for more than 3 decades. He told police that one evening back in 1994, when he was just 9 years old, he and one of his other siblings had been sent to a neighbor's house for a sleepover. During the middle of the night, he was having trouble getting to sleep, so he decided to walk back to his own house. When he got there, he claimed that he had witnessed his father being strangled to death. The perpetrators were his older brothers, Mukesh and Pradeep, their mother Urmila Devi, and another local man named Rajveer. Neighbors assumed that he had become a monk at a temple somewhere, and the situation was never really investigated much further. However, when Punjabi recently came forward, he said he had information that could back up his claims. He believed he knew where his brothers and mother had hidden his father's body, underneath the courtyard of their home. On September 26th, police conducted an excavation at the property where Punjabi told them to look. After digging about 8 feet down, they recovered skeletal remains. At the time of this recording, DNA testing still needs to be completed in order to officially identify the remains. However, police have suggested that they believe they are those of Buddha Singh. They have also issued arrest warrants for the 4 accused on charges including murder, tampering with evidence, and other offenses, though it's unclear if any of them have yet been taken into custody. As for the motive behind the crime, that's still under investigation too. However, local media reports state that it was well known that Urmila and Rajveer were having an affair. The situation is still developing. Representatives from England's Avon and Somerset Police released a massive update in a nearly 60-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, they had finally arrested and charged a man in connection with the awful crime. The case began all the way back on June 28, 1967, when a neighbor of 75-year-old Louisa Dunn noticed something suspicious outside of her home in the city of Bristol. While walking by, they could see that the window to her front room was wide open, something that was fairly unusual. When they investigated further, they discovered the horrifying reason why. Louisa was lying dead on the floor. She was dressed in a black velvet coat and shawl, and had strangulation marks on her throat. While it was clear that Louisa had died of asphyxiation, the whole thing got even more disturbing when authorities had a closer look at her body. There was evidence that she had been raped, and given that nothing appeared to be out of place in the house, this seemed to be the primary motive behind the attack. From the beginning, both police and the community at large took the case incredibly seriously. Suspects were rounded up and brought in for questioning, and fingerprints and palm prints were taken from thousands of local men in the area, the vast majority of them volunteers. However, everyone was eliminated. Unfortunately, there wasn't much else for investigators to go on at the time. Though Louisa had once been a member of Bristol's social class and her husband was in line to be the mayor, he had died unexpectedly. Louisa had eventually remarried, but her second husband also passed away. At the time of her murder, she lived alone and mostly kept to herself. Neighbors said that she had gone into a noticeable state of decline in the years leading up to the crime, though she still made a point of visiting close friends. In fact, she had spent time visiting with her friend Alice Clark the evening before she was found. This allowed police to narrow the timeline, concluding that the fatal attack had happened sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 4 a.m. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to provide a breakthrough, and the case eventually went cold. It wasn't until 2023, when the case was reopened and the evidence re-examined, that answers were finally found. This week, it was announced that a 92-year-old man named Ryland Headley had been arrested and charged with Louisa's rape and murder. Currently, almost nothing has been revealed about Headley or what allowed police to crack the case after all this time. It appears police are keeping the details close, claiming that they are doing so to protect the integrity of the investigation. Despite this, police say that they have notified Louisa's surviving family members and are happy to have provided some closure. A representative for the force stated in part, quote, "While this tragic incident happened a long time ago, there will be people who remember what happened and may have had a connection with Louisa through family or friends. This investigation is at a critical phase, and to protect the integrity of any future criminal proceedings, we won't be able to confirm the full details, but we are absolutely committed to continue carrying out a thorough investigation to try and bring Louise's relatives the answers they've waited a lifetime for. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.